All right, welcome back. This week, our deep dive is going to be in week 12 of Kevin DeYoung's Daily Doctrine. And get ready, because this week we are tackling some seriously heavy, uh, I don't know, thought-provoking topics: predestination, God's decrees, the extent of the atonement, and then how all that relates to evangelism.
Yeah, DeYoung really doesn't shy away from the meatier points of theology, does he? And that's, I think, what makes this week's readings so fascinating. I mean, we're really going to be unpacking, I think, some of the most debated and often, I think, misunderstood doctrines of the Christian faith.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just jump right in. Day 56 starts off with the question, is predestination fair?
Wow.
And right out of the gate, DeYoung takes us to Romans 9, where we see God choosing Jacob over Esau. And this is a passage that has sparked, I don't know how many, just endless theological debates, hasn't it?
It really has. And what's so striking about DeYoung's treatment of it is that he doesn't try to soften the blow or kind of explain it away by appealing to human free will, but instead he really leans into the biblical text and emphasizes that God's election is ultimately about displaying his character and serving his purposes.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. It kind of challenges us to view, I guess, God's actions through a different lens, not one of human fairness, but one of divine sovereignty.
Exactly. And that ties into his point about God's mercy.
Wow.
He really argues that God's mercy isn't constrained by anything outside of his will. And he brings up Exodus 33.19, where God declares, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion.
Yeah, that verse is, it really highlights, I think, the radical nature of God's grace, right? It's not based on our merit or worthiness, but solely on his own free choice.
Precisely. And it's a concept that can be hard to grasp, especially when we consider passages like Romans 9.1718, where God hardens Pharaoh's heart. DeYoung, however, presents this not as an act of cruelty, but as a way for God to display his power and ultimately accomplish his purposes.
Then DeYoung goes on to address a question that I'm sure many of us have wrestled with, which is, if salvation is ultimately up to God, why does he find fault with us? I mean, it feels like a natural question to ask when you're kind of considering the concept of predestination.
Right, yeah. It's a question that often arises from a sense of human justice. But DeYoung challenges the very premise of the question. He argues that we as finite beings have no right to question the infinite God. God has the right to do as he pleases. And ultimately, predestination serves a divine purpose that transcends our kind of limited understanding.
It's a humbling reminder, isn't it, that our ways are not God's ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. So much for our human ideas of fairness. DeYoung seems to be emphasizing that God's righteousness is not something we can box in with our limited human understanding.
That's right. And DeYoung emphasizes that God's righteousness is rooted in his character and purposes, as revealed in Scripture, not in our human ideas of what's fair or just. He really wants us to grapple with the complexity of these doctrines and ultimately trust in the goodness and sovereignty of God.
Okay. So then we get to day 57. And DeYoung throws out these two terms that might sound a little intimidating to some people: supralapsarianism and infralapsarianism. Can we break those down a little bit? Those almost sound like they come out of a science fiction novel or something.
They do. They sound a bit complex, but they're actually not as complicated as they might seem. These terms refer to the logical order of God's decrees, not the chronological order.
So it's not about when God made these decrees, but about the logical relationship between them. Okay, I think I'm following so far.
Exactly. So with supralapsarianism, the idea is that God's decree to save some comes before his decree to create and allow the fall. So this view really emphasizes God's sovereignty, the idea that he chose some for salvation and some for condemnation before creation even existed.
So it's like God had a plan from the very beginning, and creation and the fall were part of that plan.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. Then we have infralapsarianism. This view holds that God's decree to save comes after his decrees concerning creation and the fall. So this view emphasizes God's mercy, the idea that he chooses to save people out of a fallen humanity.
So in this view, God's decision to save comes as a response to the reality of sin and the need for redemption.
Precisely. And DeYoung mentions that he kind of leans towards infralapsarianism. He says this is as presented in the canons of Dort. But he also cautions against being overly dogmatic on this issue.
I think that's a good point, because, I mean, these are complex theological concepts, and I think, there's room for different interpretations within, the Reformed tradition.
Right, right. And the key takeaway here is that whether you lean towards supralapsarianism or infralapsarianism, God's decrees ultimately point to his mercy and glory. They reveal his sovereign control over all things and his unwavering commitment to his people.
Okay, moving on to day 58, we're introduced to this theologian named Moïse Amyraut and his unique perspective on the extent of the atonement, which DeYoung refers to as Amyraldianism. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Of course. Amyraldianism believed that Christ died for all people, but on the condition that they believe. This is sometimes called hypothetical universalism. In other words, Christ's death made salvation possible for everyone, but it only becomes actual for those who exercise faith.
So it's different from the kind of traditional Reformed view of limited atonement, which teaches that Christ died specifically for the elect.
Yes, exactly. And DeYoung also mentions John Davenant, another theologian who held a kind of a similar view. He believed that Christ's death was sufficient for all, but intended only for the elect.
So both Amyraut and Davenant were trying to kind of find a middle ground between a strictly limited atonement and a completely universal atonement.
That's right. And DeYoung points out that Amyraut's most, significant contribution was in his understanding of the order of the decrees.
Yep.
He placed the decree of universal atonement before the decree of enabling the elect to believe.
So in Amyraut's system, God first makes salvation possible for all through Christ's death, and then he chooses to enable some to believe, thereby making their salvation actual. It's an interesting way of trying to kind of reconcile the tension between God's sovereignty and human responsibility.
Yeah, it is. However, DeYoung ultimately critiques Amyraldianism, arguing that it raises some serious theological concerns. He argues that it calls into question the efficacy of Christ's atonement. You see, if Christ died for everyone on the condition that they believe, does that mean his death wasn't truly sufficient to save? And what about those who don't believe? Did Christ's death fail to accomplish its purpose for them?
That's a good point. It does seem like Amyraldianism introduces a level of, uncertainty into the atonement. It suggests that the effectiveness of Christ's sacrifice somehow hinges on human actions.
Exactly. And DeYoung also criticizes Amyraldianism for calling into question the unchangeableness of God's decrees. If God decreed to save everyone hypothetically, but then changes his mind based on whether or not they believe, does that mean God can change his mind?
Again, very good point. It seems like Amyraldianism potentially undermines the very nature of God's sovereignty and the immutability of his decrees. So it's a fascinating attempt to reconcile difficult doctrines, but as DeYoung points out, it seems to create more problems than it solves.
That's a good summary of DeYoung's perspective. I mean, he really challenges us to wrestle with these complex issues and think deeply about the implications of our kind of theological commitments. And ultimately, he reminds us that the traditional Reformed understanding of God's sovereignty and the limited atonement is the view that best aligns with the biblical text.
So it seems like we're diving into some pretty deep theological waters here, but it's definitely stimulating, to say the least. I'm really enjoying this exploration of DeYoung's arguments.
Me too. And we're just getting started. We'll pick up next time with Day 59 and explore another attempt to reconcile divine sovereignty and human free will, Luis de Molina and his concept of middle knowledge. Until then, let these ideas kind of simmer a bit. It's worth pondering, I think, the implications of what we've discussed so far. Welcome back to our deep dive into Week 12 of Kevin DeYoung's Daily Doctrine. Last time we left off discussing Amyraldianism, and now on Day 59 we encounter another fascinating attempt to reconcile divine sovereignty with human freedom. Luis de Molina and his concept of middle knowledge.
Yes, middle knowledge, or Molinism, as it's often called. It's a complex but very intriguing concept. Curious to hear how DeYoung tackles this one.
Well, he starts by explaining Molina's idea that God possesses not just one or two, but three distinct types of knowledge.
Okay, so break that down for me. What are these three types of knowledge?
The first is what Molina calls natural knowledge. And this refers to God's knowledge of all necessary truths, things that must be true in all possible worlds. So think of mathematical equations or the laws of logic.
So this is knowledge that is, in a sense, independent of God's will. It's just the way things are.
Exactly. Then you have free knowledge. And this is God's knowledge of things that are true because he has freely chosen them to be true. For example, God's decision to create the world or to send his son Jesus.
Okay, so this is knowledge that is based on God's own will and actions.
Right. And then finally, you have the, I guess, the most interesting one, middle knowledge. And this is God's knowledge of what free creatures would do in any given circumstance, even if those circumstances never actually come to pass.
So it's like God knows all the possible choices we could make, even if we never actually make them.
Precisely. And this is the key to Molina's system, because it allows him to say that God can know the future free actions of humans without determining those actions.
Yeah, so it's like God is looking at this vast library of all the possible what-if scenarios, and he's using that knowledge to guide his own actions and decrees.
That's a great analogy. And Molina argued that this middle knowledge allows God to kind of orchestrate the world in such a way that his purposes are accomplished even while preserving human free will.
So it's a sophisticated attempt to thread the needle between divine sovereignty and human freedom. But I'm guessing DeYoung has some critiques of Molinism as well.
He does. He offers three main critiques. First, he argues that middle knowledge assumes a level of human autonomy that really doesn't square with the biblical emphasis on God's absolute control over all things.
So DeYoung is saying that if God knows what we would do in any given circumstance, does that mean our choices are truly free? Or are they, in some sense, kind of predetermined by God's middle knowledge?
That's the heart of his critique. He's really pushing back against the idea that our choices could have any kind of independent existence apart from God's sovereign will.
It's a really thought-provoking point. What are DeYoung's other critiques of Molinism?
His second critique is that middle knowledge doesn't really explain the origin of these would-be truths. I mean, if God knows what we would do in any given situation, where does that knowledge come from? It doesn't seem to fit neatly into either natural knowledge or free knowledge.
So DeYoung is essentially saying that middle knowledge is a bit of a mystery. It's not clear how it fits into our understanding of God's omniscience.
Exactly. And finally, DeYoung argues that middle knowledge makes God's will dependent on the potential choices of his creatures. He says that this view undermines God's sovereignty and makes it seem as though God is somehow reacting to human choices rather than being the ultimate cause of all things.
That's a crucial point. I mean, DeYoung consistently emphasizes the absolute sovereignty of God throughout Daily Doctrine. It makes sense that he would, push back against any view that seems to diminish God's control over creation.
Yes. And he ultimately concludes that while Molinism is, an intellectually stimulating attempt to reconcile divine sovereignty and human freedom, it ultimately falls short because it fails to fully account for the radical nature of God's sovereignty as revealed in Scripture.
So it sounds like DeYoung is challenging us to wrestle with these complex doctrines, and think carefully about the implications of our theological commitments.
He definitely is. And that brings us to day 60, where DeYoung tackles a very practical question, evangelism and the sovereignty of God.
Yeah, this is a question that has probably crossed the mind of every Christian at some point. If God has already chosen who will be saved, why bother evangelizing?
It's a common objection. And DeYoung addresses it head on. He argues that the Bible consistently presents God's sovereignty and the call to evangelism as complementary truths, not contradictory ones.
So he's not trying to, downplay or explain away the tension between these two concepts, but he wants us to kind of embrace the paradox.
Exactly. DeYoung points out that God can work without means, but he typically chooses to work through means, and those means include our faithful proclamation of the gospel.
So while God is ultimately the one who draws people to himself, he often uses human instruments to accomplish his purposes.
Precisely. DeYoung uses the analogy of a shepherd and his sheep. He draws from John 6, where Jesus teaches that sinners can't come to him unless the Father draws them. But that doesn't stop Jesus from, extending a genuine offer of the gospel.
Yeah, it's a beautiful picture of God's sovereignty kind of working in harmony with human responsibility. He's in control, yet he invites us to participate in his redemptive plan.
Yes, and DeYoung argues that election is actually a support for evangelism, not a hindrance. If we truly believe that God has chosen a people for himself, then we can be confident that our efforts to share the gospel are not in vain.
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
It's not just about hoping that someone might respond to the message, but it's about trusting that God is already at work, drawing his elect to himself.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really fascinating point that DeYoung makes about the relationship between election and evangelism. He argues that a firm belief in election can actually fuel our evangelistic efforts.
Yeah, that seems kind of counterintuitive. How does knowing that God has already chosen who will be saved motivate us to evangelize?
Well, DeYoung points out that it eliminates the anxiety and pressure of thinking that the success of our evangelism depends solely on our own persuasive abilities. We're not trying to manipulate people into making a decision. We're simply proclaiming the truth and trusting God to do the rest.
So it's a shift from a human-centered approach to evangelism to a God-centered approach. We're not trying to force God's hand, but we're aligning ourselves with his will and trusting in his power to work through us.
Exactly. And DeYoung argues that this kind of confidence and boldness is exactly what the early church possessed. They were convinced of God's sovereignty and the truth of the gospel, and that conviction fueled their fearless proclamation of the message.
That's a powerful reminder for us today. I mean, it's easy to get bogged down in the complexities of theology or to be intimidated by the challenges of evangelism, but ultimately our task is simple: to faithfully proclaim the gospel, trusting that God will use our efforts to accomplish his purposes.
Beautifully put. And on that note, I think it's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive into week 12 of Daily Doctrine. We've explored the intricacies of middle knowledge and tackled I guess, the perennial question of how God's sovereignty relates to our responsibility to evangelize. But there's still more to unpack, so join us next time as we wrap up this week's readings and consider the implications of these doctrines for our lives. So, it's interesting how DeYoung manages to bring such complex theological concepts, down to earth and show how they connect to our everyday lives as Christians.
Yeah, he really has a gift for that, doesn't he? I mean, it'd be
Yeah.
so easy to get lost in the abstract weeds of all these doctrines, but he really consistently brings us back to the heart of the matter, like how these truths shape our understanding of God and our role in his plan.
Exactly. And on day 60, he really drives that point home by highlighting how a deep understanding of God's sovereignty can actually empower and embolden our evangelism.
Yeah, it's true. He challenges that common misconception that a belief in predestination inevitably leads to apathy or inaction, I guess, when it comes to sharing our faith. And he actually argues that the opposite is true.
It's almost like a paradox, right? Knowing that God is sovereign and that he has chosen a people for himself gives us a sense of confidence and urgency in our mission.
Right, exactly. And it takes the pressure off of us in a sense. We don't have to worry about having all the right answers or coming up with a perfect sales pitch. Our job is simply to be faithful in proclaiming the truth and trusting God to work through us.
And I love how DeYoung supports this by pointing to the example of the Apostle Paul. I mean, here's a man who was deeply convinced of God's sovereignty, yet he was also one of the most passionate and effective evangelists in history.
Such a good point. Challenges that stereotype, the Calvinists just sitting back and passively waiting for God to do all the work. Paul was a man of action, driven by a deep love for God and a burning desire to see others come to know Christ.
Absolutely. And it's not just Paul. DeYoung mentions other, prominent figures in church history who were both staunch Calvinists and zealous evangelist people like Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, William Carey. I mean, these were men who understood the depths of God's sovereignty, yet they were also consumed with a passion to see the lost come to Christ.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if their understanding of election actually fueled their zeal,
Yeah.
knowing that God had chosen a people for himself might have given them this kind of unshakable confidence in the power of the gospel message.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like they knew that they were working in partnership with God, that they were part of something so much bigger than themselves. They weren't just trying to persuade people with, clever arguments, but they were proclaiming a message that carried with it the very power of God.
And that's what makes their evangelistic efforts so compelling. They weren't driven by guilt or a sense of obligation, but they were overflowing with joy and gratitude for the grace that they'd received, and they just couldn't help but share that good news with others.
Yes, and that's the kind of evangelism that DeYoung is calling us to embrace, an evangelism that's rooted in a deep understanding of God's sovereignty, fueled by a genuine love for others, and characterized by a humble confidence in the power of the gospel.
It's not about manipulating people or trying to force their hand, but it's about pointing them to the truth of who God is and what he has done for us in Christ.
Beautifully said. And ultimately, that's what this week's deep dive into daily doctrine has been all about, helping us to see the beauty and coherence of God's plan of redemption, from the eternal decree of election to the call to go into all the world and preach the gospel.
Yeah, it's been a challenging but incredibly enriching journey through some of the most profound doctrines of the Christian faith.
And I hope our listeners are walking away with a deeper understanding of God's sovereignty, a renewed appreciation for the wonder of His grace, and a fresh passion to share the good news of salvation with those around them.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. So until next time, keep diving deep into the riches of God's Word and seeking to apply these truths to your everyday life.